This is Business Live, the top stories this morning. Breaking news, the embattled chief executive of the Post Office, Nick Reed, resigns as he prepares to give evidence to the inquiry into the Horizon IT scandal. Inflation sticks above target at 2.2%. We'll discuss what it means for interest rates ahead of tomorrow's Bank of England decision. Plus, why British chief executives remain upbeat about the growth of the UK economy. A very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us from the Sky newsroom. Well, we start with the breaking news this morning that the chief executive of the Post Office, Nick Reed, is to step down. Mr. Reed had temporarily stepped back from the role in July to prepare for the next stage of the Fujitsu Horizon scandal inquiry. Our city editor, Mark Kleiman, had the scoop. He joins me now to discuss this. Mark, great to have you with us as always. So why has this unfolded and why now?
Well, I think it's unfolded, Wilfred, because Nick Reed has been under an enormous amount of pressure for quite a lot of his 5-year tenure, but particularly during the course of this year. You'll remember back at the start of the year, there was an unseemly political row involving Nick Reed's former boss, Henry Staunton, who was the chairman of the Post Office. He was sacked by the then business secretary and now Conservative leadership contender, Kemi Badenoch. Over a series of rows to do with a whistleblower and other areas of corporate governance. And during that public row that unfolded, Mr. Reed was accused repeatedly of seeking inflated pay rises for himself at the expense of running the Post Office, which after all is a state-owned company. So there was a very public battle at the time, the start of this year. And I think from that perspective, Nick Reed's days were numbered. And when he announced a couple of months ago that he was stepping back temporarily from his chief executive's post to concentrate on the evidence that he will give to the Horizon IT scandal inquiry next month, I think there was an element of surprise that he wasn't stepping back permanently at that point. So we've had this confirmation this morning from the Post Office that he will leave in March 2025. I am told, incidentally, Wilfred, that he will not receive a payoff when he steps down. He will be paid for his notice period, but he will not be paid a penny more than that.
Mark Kleiman, as always, thanks so much. Great work on breaking that story an hour or two ago. Joining me now to discuss it in more detail, Nick Wallace, the journalist and author of The Great Post Office Scandal. Nick, thanks so much for joining us. Clearly he was on temporary leave from CEO already. Was it expected this would become permanent, or is this out of the blue?
No, this is inevitable. The moment that he said he was going to step down in order to focus on the work that he had to do was the beginning of the end. This is a chief executive who came in just before the High Court judgment, which proved the sub-postmasters right back in 2019. And the efforts of the Post Office to sort out the compensation for sub-postmasters has been risible, to say the least. We've heard Joe Hamilton at the National Television Awards last week just talking about how terrible the compensation debate has been for the Post Office. On top of that, he lost a lot of credibility when he turned up to a parliamentary select committee earlier this year, appearing not to be on his brief when it came to talking about what was required of him as a chief executive and as the Post Office in terms of providing redress to sub-postmasters. And this pernicious rumour that has been following him around about his focus on his salary rather than the job that he should be doing. We've heard several people inside the Post Office saying that he was obsessed with getting a pay rise out of the government rather than focusing his mind on the job. So his credibility as chief executive has taken a nosedive this year. So when he announced he was standing back to concentrate on his evidence to the inquiry, I saw it as almost completely inevitable that he would be just moving away from the business, because how could he pick up the reins after taking so many months off to focus on something which he didn't appear to be that interested in beforehand?
And do you think, Nick, that he will still appear at the rest of the inquiry, and will it change the focus at all of what he's grilled on?
Well, I do hope it might persuade him to be a little bit more candid about the rows that he's had with the senior executives on the Post Office board. I mean, don't get Henry Staunton, and he seemed to fall out. He seemed to fall out with his chief financial officer, Alistair Cameron. Now, if he could be a little bit more honest about what has been going on at the Post Office throughout his tenure. When I interviewed him last year, he said he took over an organisation that he was thinking would be going through a business transformation process, but in fact was an organisation in paralysis and crisis. He has had the unenviable task of trying to turn around a supertanker, but I think by any stretch of the imagination, he simply has not succeeded. So it is time for him to go, and this is obviously the right time for him.
You mentioned his salary and a focus on that he may or may not have had. What is his salary? And Mark Kleiman, they're reporting there's no specific payoff, but he will be paid through his notice period, which will be a matter of months, not weeks. It'll take him into 2025.
Well, with bonuses, he could bring home around £800,000 a year. And don't forget that the job of Post Office Chief Executive is a public salary job. He is paid by the taxpayer to deliver the Post Office services. Yes, he could possibly earn more money in the private sector, but when you think of that salary compared to what senior civil service mandarins or the Prime Minister or government ministers actually get, it's a huge amount of money. And yet he was receiving that amount of money and still trying to batter down the door of the Secretary of State in order to get a pay rise. So yes, he's only going to be paid exactly what he's due until the end of his notice period, but there'll be many people who just think that's an awful lot of money given what he's been presiding over the past 5 years of his tenure.
Just to sort of wrap things up, though, Nick, with some perspective, he became CEO in 2019. So when we talk about what he's presided over in light of this story that, of course, has grabbed so much public attention, he wasn't actually in post during the years in which the scandal itself was unfolding.
That's true, but his one job was to ensure that the sub-postmasters who had fought tooth and nail to even get the opportunity to be in the room when compensation and redress was being discussed, were treated fairly by the organisation that had done so badly by them. And if you listen to so many sub-postmasters who are still campaigning now, who are nearing the ends of their lives, to have had to suffer because of what the Post Office did to them, they still haven't had the money that they deserve and believe they deserve throughout this last 5 years. And that has to be down to him. At the end of the day, he's the chief executive. The buck stops with him. Yes, of course, he has to run the Post Office itself, which is a big job. But equally, or perhaps more important, was doing right by his former employees, who the Post Office, his predecessors, had wronged so much.
Nick Wallace, great to see you. Thanks for joining us. To our other main story now, and it's a big week for economic data. All eyes will be on the Federal Reserve tonight and then the Bank of England tomorrow. An interest rate cut here now looks a little less likely thanks to today's inflation figure, which came in line with expectations. The Consumer Price Index remained at 2.2% for the month of August, according to the Office for National Statistics. Of course, that is above the Bank of England's target of 2%, though. Core inflation, which strips out energy prices, food, alcohol and tobacco, was 3.6% in August, up from 3.3% in July, while services inflation, a key metric for the Bank of England, will be watching the decide, which they'll be watching, came in at 5.6% last month, up from 5.2% in July. It was mostly driven by a 22.2% rise in airfares. Finally, housing inflation, which refers to both renters and homeowners, remained unchanged at 3.1%. Well, let's bring in our business correspondent, Paul Kelso. Paul, break down the significance of this data. You know, in line, 2.2%, in line with expectations, but a bit above the target. But quite a lot of that underlying data and how it will play out in the Monetary Policy Committee members' minds when they make their decision tomorrow.
Yeah, the headline figure doesn't tell the whole story, but these numbers will be being watched. I think the Monetary Policy Committee sit down to meet today and that decision becomes public tomorrow at lunchtime. This is the path of consumer price inflation over the last few years, and we're familiar with this mountain. It climbed up to 11.7%, caused by energy spikes, food inflation as a result of the war in Ukraine. But the descent has long begun. It's come down almost as rapidly as we went up. Hit the Bank of England's target rate here. This is the number they're trying to maintain prices at 2%. Hit it in June, ticked up 2.2% in July, and it's remained at that figure in August. Well, it looks pretty low. What's the bank worried about? Let's have a look at what they're worried about. The numbers and the elements in the next chart we can show you that make up that overall inflation. A lot of lines, we'll go through them slowly. That red line on the last chart, CPI inflation, is now the green line. That's the overall rate of inflation, but there's two elements to it. Look, goods inflation actually deflating, minus 0.9% in the year to August. So the price of your basket of shopping, which includes all sorts of things you can't fit in a basket, actually falling. Good news for consumers. But services inflation, which dominate the economy, 80% of the British economy, still rising, over 5%, up to 5.6% last month in these numbers. A lot of that's driven by wages. Employers paying more to keep up with prices during that inflationary spike, and the bank's concern has been that that wage impact, the secondary impacts as they call them, will cause inflation to stick even once the price shocks around energy, food, labour shortages, which contributed, once they've passed, which they have, we're stuck with inflation. And that's this blue line, core inflation. That's the inflation figure with the volatile elements, fuel, alcohol, food prices, which are commodity driven, so they fluctuate. It's at 3.6% and still rising. And that is the reason, the view of the markets is that the bank will hold rates tomorrow at 5%. They won't be tempted to take another quarter point off because they're concerned that if they do, that loosens the economy too much and this core inflation figure might take off further. The direction of travel is clear. The European Central Bank last week cut by a quarter percentage point. You mentioned the Federal Reserve this evening. The only debate in America is whether it will be a quarter point or a half point they will cut. Jay Powell's made it clear a cut is coming. So they're all moving in the same direction. But the Bank of England, having walked us up literally to the top of a rates mountain, want 5.25% to be the top. They've come down a quarter point, probably won't move tomorrow, but another move in November is likely. The markets think we'll be down to 3.5% by the end of next year. That's 16 months, is it? It's going to feel quite a long time if you're looking for a mortgage.
Paul Kelso, great stuff. Thanks so much for that. Bank of England decision, of course, tomorrow. Federal Reserve tonight at about 7 p.m. And you can read more about both and indeed those inflation figures that Paul was just breaking down for you on our Money blog. Well worth checking that out. Scan the QR code on the screen to break down what it means for mortgages. Also, I'll break down for you what the Taylor Swift effect played on services inflation over the summer. Time for some other business stories now. And the European General Court has found in favour of Alphabet in a dispute regarding an EU antitrust case against the company, which we reported on Monday. Google's parent company challenged the €1.5 billion EU fine, which was issued in 2019 for hindering online search advertising. The fine's one of three, the total cost of which was €8.25 billion for Google. BlackRock and Microsoft are planning to launch an AI fund in order to finance the building of data centers and energy projects, including debt financing. The fund could raise up to $100 billion. The recent scaling up of AI capabilities is already straining energy infrastructure, and companies are expecting to face severe capacity bottlenecks as AI usage ramps up. Asda has confirmed that its co-owner, Mohsin Issa, will step back from running the UK's third largest grocery chain. Asda's chairman, Lord Stuart Rose, will assume the role alongside TDR Capital's Rob Hattrell. Asda is majority owned by Issa and TDR Capital, while US giant Walmart, its previous owner, still retains a 10% stake. UK chief executives are still upbeat about future growth of the economy here, although confidence has dipped slightly since last year. KPMG, one of the big four accounting firms, spoke to hundreds of global and UK CEOs about the big issues affecting their businesses. On the growth of generative AI, 71% of UK business leaders saw it as an opportunity for their workforce. And the number of CEOs expecting a full return to the office jumped by nearly 20% compared to last year. Joining us to discuss this survey data is John Holt, the UK Chief Executive and Senior Partner at KPMG. A very good morning to you. Thanks so much for joining us, John.
Thank you.
So let's hit with that headline point of overall. There's reasonable confidence from CEOs about the outlook for the UK economy?
Yeah, look, it's stayed fairly stable from one year to the next. There's still cautious optimism about the future. I think businesses understand that the Chancellor has some hard choices to make. People are looking to the 30th of October as a critical date. But yeah, generally positive. You know, 3/4 of businesses still believe they're confident about the growth of their business. And, 4 out of 5 are confident about the UK economy. So generally a positive outlook.
Are interest rates critical to that, or more importantly, the budget and what happens to tax and spending?
Stability, I think, is the key. People want stability. They want a roadmap going forward. But people know the Chancellor has hard choices to make. But they need to have stability. They need to understand what the business roadmap is going forward. Then they can plan for the future. So I think that's the critical date which will unlock confidence in the economy.
Let's talk about this question you asked CEOs about work from home. It's an interesting week when the Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, was talking about wanting to allow more flexible work, while Amazon was announcing that they want everyone to come back to the office. What are the expectations of CEOs of where that trend heads in the years ahead?
Yeah, look, the biggest change from the 2023 survey was that it's a 20% increase in CEOs' expectations of going back to a pre-COVID work pattern, and then that they reward people who went back into the office. The truth is that there is not one size fits all. Different businesses, it suits them in a different way. For my business, we used to work at client sites, we used to work in the office. We now have a third site, which is that people work from home, and it actually works for us. But businesses are different. But that is the big change in the survey. There's clearly a move amongst UK CEOs in the expectations will go back to more in-office working.
What about generative AI? We teased that a little bit. You were asking business leaders about this. They're saying it's an opportunity. That's not that surprising, but an opportunity even for the workforce?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of negativity about generative AI and the impact on workforces, and I think it's misplaced sometimes. I think it's a great enabler. I think it's an amazing opportunity to upskill people. It's an amazing opportunity to increase productivity. I don't think it'll necessarily have a negative impact on the workforce. That's played out in the survey, where 71% thought it wouldn't have a negative impact on the workforce. In fact, a third thought it would actually increase the number of jobs. So I think we need to change the narrative a bit about generative AI and the opportunities that it presents to people.
What's the view towards trade? I mean, it comes at an interesting geopolitical moment. Maybe trade terms will improve a little bit with the EU in the years ahead. But meanwhile, particularly with the US election in focus, it doesn't look like Western trade terms with the likes of China will improve. Is that a concern for CEOs here in the UK?
Well, actually, geopolitics in its broadest sense, trade was not top of the sort of risks that people saw. Cybersecurity was the thing that was top of the risks and concerns that CEOs had. That makes sense. If you think generative AI is the big opportunity and the thing that people are going to invest in, then it makes sense that cybersecurity is also the thing that they're concerned about, and supply chains in terms of their net zero targets. So people are always very interested in trade and the opportunities to trade more freely, but it's not top of the list of things that people have come out in the survey.
John Holt, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
The Chief Executive there of KPMG in the UK. Well, still to come here on Business Live, we'll take a look at how the markets are doing this morning. That's up next.
When you cover big, tense protests, there's almost always a moment when the atmosphere changes. There's a different noise, and you start to smell tear gas in the air.
As a team, we've interviewed some of the biggest stars in the world. Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt. It can be incredibly surreal being swept up in their world, but we try to give you an honest sense of how these people really are.
When we spoke to the fishermen down in Cornwall, all the politics from Westminster was a million miles away. This was about their jobs, their livelihoods.
Trust in politics is at an all-time low. What's going wrong, and can we fix it? It's from Liz. She wants to know, why is there still no sign of the Labour Party electing a woman as leader?
It's sort of embarrassing. It takes a very strong man to be leader, but it takes an even stronger man to support a woman for leader.
If you want to be mean to politicians, crack on. The activists that go out and make elections happen, I kind of feel like just don't be horrible to them. Be polite to them in the same way that they're polite to you.
Keir Starmer has got us into government with a big majority. He was completely clear before the election that he wasn't going to be able to do the two-child benefit policy, but I wouldn't be surprised if it isn't an early thing that comes along.
I went up to Gordon Brown and said, hello. No, yes, what is it? I said, found all these Tory candidates breaking land. Let me see it. This is brilliant.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's Chief North of England correspondent. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news.
Our app gives you the very best of Sky News wherever you are. Breaking news, videos and analysis.
Evidence of the crisis.
Podcasts, watching us live.
Live here from Washington.
Wherever you get your podcast.
All in one place. And all at just the touch of a screen. The Sky News app. Get the full story first.
This is the game changer seat. Look, it even comes with binoculars. Fly Emirates. Fly better.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Business Live. Let's have a little look at how the markets are trading today. Well, Asia closed mostly high. As you can see, the Australian index only up by 4 basis points, but Hong Kong had a healthy gain. Decent gains as well for Shanghai and Japan. Japan recovering from some losses earlier in the week, in large part because of the stronger yen against a weaker US dollar. Let's have a look at European trade, which is red across the board, not too pronounced, but you're seeing a decent decline, 0.4% in both France and across the broader Stocks 600 index, whereas the declines for Germany and Italy just fractional, 0.1%. You've got Spain fractionally higher there. A big mover in Italy is Campari, the drinks maker, down 6% after their CEO resigned unexpectedly. It follows a big drop as well on Friday when they reported disappointing earnings. So a bad week or so for Campari. If we look at the FTSE 100, it's down 0.6%, so similar declines to what we're seeing in France. In fact, a bit more than that now, down 0.7%. PZ Cussons is down about 10% after the owner of brands like Imperial Leather and others reported a 20% slide in revenue, a 40% slide in profits. Reckitt Benckiser, the consumer goods company, offsetting that a bit. It's up 2% after decent results. Legal & General, meanwhile, is a little bit lower, announcing the sale of Cala Homes. A quick look at currencies. All eyes really on currencies and bond markets today ahead of the Federal Reserve decision. The pound up again 0.4% today. Dollar thus a little bit weaker against it. And look at oil prices, which are softening a bit today, over 1%, just below $73 on Brent. It was below 70 to start the month after a very poor couple of weeks over the summer trade, but bounced a bit of that from the early part of the week, but giving back 1% or nearly $1. 72.80, the price of Brent. Now, days after a second apparent assassination attempt on his life, Donald Trump's returned to the campaign trail, admitting being president is a dangerous business. Our data and forensics correspondent Tom Cheshire's been looking at how the apparent attempt on his life might impact the polls in just under a couple of months' time.
An assassination attempt would be huge news in any race. This isn't even the first one. We also had a debate last week. What is all that doing to the polls? Well, this is a Sky poll tracker and actually fairly steady for Harris, even though we've had some of the most recent polls following that debate. Well, that's because this is an average. We're looking for reliable polls. Polling is slow as a result. But what is quick is money. And this shows the bookies' favourite to become the next US president. And this is a lot more reactive. You can see things happen in real time. So take this. We can see the reaction to that apparent assassination attempt actually showing a drop in Donald Trump's support. Compare that to earlier this summer over here. With that initial assassination attempt in Pennsylvania, there was a surge for Trump. Now, this is people putting their money where their mouth is. That's a pound sign, and that says 66 million pounds being bet so far. £1 billion was bet in total. It does seem to have some predictive power. Look over here. This is the debate between Biden and Trump. Biden's odds dropped off a cliff after that. Or we compare that to over here, where we can see the effects of that Harris-Trump debate. Seems like Harris, that has helped her in terms of the bookies' odds. But what's really obvious here is this is a back and forth with, one candidate edging against the other, wheel-to-wheel racing, as it were. So why is that discrepancy between the polls, which look fairly steady? Well, it's because of the nature of this race. It's a race to 270 electoral college votes, each state casting its votes. Now, there are all these states in red and blue here. They end up in those columns for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. We're really interested in these swing states. These are the ones that are going to decide the course of this election. Now, we have polling for those states. It's very tight in all of them. But here is one scenario based on that polling where we've given some of those states, according to the polling, to Harris, some of those according to Trump. The one we've left out for now is this one, the 19 electoral college votes of Pennsylvania. Now, Kamala Harris is slightly ahead there, but again, really, really tiny in terms of the lead. If you put that in her column, she's the president. She gets over that 270 line. But if Donald Trump wins that, well, he is president again. So there's tiny margins here, but actually it's even tinier than just the state. If we look at what happened last time round, Biden versus Trump, this is the final electoral college map. Let's look at what happened in Pennsylvania, because this whole state came down to just 80,000 votes. And you think that's tiny? Well, look at 2016. Trump versus Hillary Clinton. This, in terms of the overall difference, that was just 44,000 votes.